Savarkar continues to be a fault line in contemporary Indian politics. In fact, literally not a day goes by when one or the other politician isn't sparring over the legacy of Veer Savarkar, including allies like the Shiv Sena and the Congress Party. But is there a way to understand Savarkar's impact on political thought going beyond the binaries? I'm Barkha Dutt. You're watching The Mojo Story. Our focus today is on a book that seeks to do precisely that. It seeks to explore Savarkar's sense of Hindutva as a history, but also Savarkar's acknowledgement that Hindutva essentially is actually really complicated to define. Today, it's kind of used as a shorthand and interchangeable word for right-wing politics that define the BJP. But what is it really, and how does Savarkar view it? Is there a way to understand one of the most contentious, debated figures of contemporary Indian history in a way that goes beyond the cliches and the tropes? Our guest today is Vinayak Chaturvedi, who fascinatingly is somebody who was in fact named after Savarkar by his pediatrician, who was known as the second Savarkar. It's a really intriguing autobiographical framing of an academic work, one that I've rarely seen before. So Vinayak, welcome to the program. Your book is fascinating in many ways, but I want you to start by telling our audience the story of how you came to be called Vinayak, how your pediatrician named you so, and what his own story was.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. The story of my name was told to me by my family as I was growing up. And what struck me was I was born in India, in Gwalior, Madhya Pradesh, but grew up in the United States. And every time I would come back to India, what was interesting was my older male relatives would tell me that I had a very unusual name. And this struck me as quite odd, coming back to India, that I was being told I had an unusual name. And the reason was that my first name was given to me by a Maharashtrian doctor, my pediatrician in Gwalior, who also happened to be the individual who supplied Nathuram Godse with the handgun that ended up killing Gandhi. This doctor's name was Dattatreya Parchure, and he was very actively involved in the Hindu Mahasabha in Gwalior, and founded the Gwalior branch of the Hindu Mahasabha, and was very close also to the Godse family, and was also very closely connected to Savarkar himself. As the story goes, as I write about in my book, is that there were hundreds upon hundreds of male children that this doctor named Vinayak. And so now it's no surprise, Vinayak used to be known as a Western Indian or Southern Indian name, but it's now become nationalized. So that's kind of the abbreviated version of the story of the name.
But, as I was reading about it in your book, what struck me was that this particular doctor, who, as you said, supplied the gun to Godse, he was not, and correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't get a clear sense of that in the book. He was not treated as some sort of notorious figure. He was a pediatrician. He was the trusted person to whom families brought their little children. So it isn't that he was stabbed in some ways, socially, ideologically, because of his loyalty to Savarkar or his having supplied that gun to Nathuram Godse.
Well, I think locally within Gwalior, you do have, there is a local myth around the doctor. And there are individuals who are, who are sympathetic to either the RSS or the Mahasabha. And so he does have this reputation. Now, unfortunately, my grandmother who took me to see this doctor passed away, so I wasn't able to speak to her about this story. But what was clear to me is that, my parents were not aware of the background of why this doctor wanted to name me Vinayak and other children Vinayak. But it was really, I think, in many ways, if we think of Ganesh as the remover of obstacles, that parents or family members taking sick children to a doctor who is therefore removing obstacles, in a sense, that was the connection my parents had. And also Ganesh as a very popular Hindu deity The name just stuck after that. So there was no political context within my family per se. And it was only me sort of when I was much older, investigating the story, interviewing the doctor's son, that I got to learn about kind of this narrative, which got me connected to thinking about and reading about Savarkar's writings overall. His Essentials of Hindutva, the first, I would say about 80 pages of the text, is actually about the politics of naming. So in many ways, there was this kind of interesting connection between Savarkar's desire to name Hindus and also the doctor who's taken this up on a very kind of local level of wanting to name individuals after Savarkar's death in 1966.
Now, the first opening sentence of your book actually calls Savarkar a difficult figure. And, your central argument is that neither those who eulogize him nor those who condemn him have actually, in fact, bothered to go through his written works. And going through his written works may give you a sense of his political thought and his very strategic, in a way, to politics and to Hindu identity. When you call him a difficult figure, do you mean, therefore, that he's essentially difficult to slot? And the present polarities, he's a sort of big source of contention and talking point in India's politics today. These present polarities, neither of them do him justice. If justice is the right word, neither of them capture him in all of his multi-layered complexity.
Right. I mean, I say difficult, not only in terms of his reception among his supporters and his critics, but also difficult in the sense his writings are voluminous at one level. They're in multiple languages. They're difficult because he's writing under very difficult circumstances throughout his lifetime. He's either being monitored and censored, or he's being surveilled, or he's seen as the political enemy. And so therefore his writings have always been kind of very fragmentary. And I also think that, the challenges of reading his work is part of that, right? And so for me, that was part of the difficulty, but there's also the personal difficulty for me, right? In the sense of this autobiographical context. There's also a difficulty among, I would say, over the last 100 years, very few people have actually sat down to read systematically his writings. Neither his supporters. I mean, it's not simply that those who are antagonistic to his ideas have refused to read him, but also even his supporters, more or less, have not engaged with his ideas. Many people have written about his life. There's many biographies. There are many hagiographies. There are many people who treat him almost like a deity. There are others who want to condemn him as a monster. But in both those polarities, you don't treat him as this human subject who actually has written a voluminous amount. And in order to understand today's political situation, political condition, the state that we live in India, I think it's really important to actually read his writings, right? And actually engage with his writings, not for the purpose of simply supporting those writings, but actually for interrogating what he's really saying. To try to understand the contemporary moment really requires, I think, an engagement with his ideas.
So one of the things that struck me as being very relevant to the contemporary moment is the idea of this unified Hindu identity. Clearly, the BJP's political goal, for instance, has been to subsume different caste groups within this Hindu identity. And occasionally there is also RSS leaders who will come forth and describe the idea of being Hindu as actually defined by the Indus River and not by faith itself. Your book actually talks a little bit about Savarkar's idea of blood unifying who Hindus are, and the idea of purity of blood, and less perhaps as ideologically believed and even more strategically argued. Could you speak a little bit about this idea of the purity of blood that binds, in his mind or in his arguments, Hindus together?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting argument. Again, it's in his Essentials of Hindutva that he really unpacks this idea of blood. But before he engages in discussion of Hindu blood, he also says that all humans have polluted blood. All right. There's a sentence which is one of my favorite sentences in his writings, which is he says, the sexual urges of mankind are more powerful than any prophet. right? Recognizing that all humans have impure blood. But what he also says is that if you look at the nationalists across the world, no one is arguing for the construction of a human state, right? Everyone, and so there's this kind of humanist element that Savarkar evokes in his writings. And he says that if you make any claim for a nationalist argument, you're therefore not arguing for a human state. And so therefore you're being partial. Therefore you're being discriminatory in that way. So he has this kind of analytical framing of understanding of human blood as all being, that there's no such thing as pure blood. But simultaneously he says, but I'm going to make an argument for the purity of Hindu blood. I'm going to make an argument that whether you're an Adivasi, you're an untouchable, a Dalit, you are a Brahmin, we all share what he says is Hindu blood. So I think there is this complexity to his argument, but he's really pushing this idea of creating a Hindu unity, which he says we just have to feel our blood is shared, right? As opposed to sort of an analytical point that we do share, Hindu blood.
And when you began researching and reading his writings, did you find your own assumptions prior to that challenged? Because, everybody understands Savarkar today in India just through the prism of their own politics. Nothing actually else seems to matter. As you said, he's either a deity or he's literally treated as a sort of treacherous being to be condemned by the other side. What was that one perhaps assumption that you had before you really got deeper into his work that you found yourself surprised by?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I have to now think regarding,
was there anything you discovered that surprised you?
I think the one thing that surprised me and that has stayed with me in many ways is his absolute assertion that the Hindu becomes the Hindu in the act of violence, right? So, I mean, and in part, that's why I also called the book Hindutva and Violence, because he, in many ways, Savarkar is a theorist and a thinker of violence, and the desire to redefine the Hindu as a violent being, a Hindu who has the capacity for violence, right? And in many ways, his desire to write histories, first about the 19th century, then about the 16th, 17th and 18th century, then going all the way back to antiquity, to the ancient world, was to demonstrate that Hindus have always been in conflict, that Hindus have always taken up arms, and that Hindus have been in a permanent war, or what he called a perpetual war, since the ancient world to the present. And if you listen to today's proponents of Hindutva, one of the things that they argue is that we're in a new 1,000-year war. So in a sense, his idea that the Hindu is becoming the Hindu in the very act of violence is something that struck me as very important. I guess a secondary thing that struck me was that there was a great celebration of Savarkar as an anti-imperialist. And you hear about this all the time, that he was one of the great anti-imperialists of the early 20th century. But what I found was that he's actually a great celebrator of empires, right? The main problem for him is that the Hindu empire has not, he needs to resurrect the Hindu empire. The Hindu empire has been in decline. And I think for those two arguments, I think really reshape the ways in which we understand Savarkar today. And I guess the third argument would be regarding the argument about Veer, the bravery of Savarkar. I mean, what I found probably most surprising, I mean, to come directly to your question, that Savarkar writes and is the most prolific biographer and autobiographer of his life in the first half of the 20th century as well. So the ways in which he's remembered by his supporters today is exactly how he documented he wanted his life to be narrated. So I think all three of those things in different ways were probably the most revealing for me in the process of doing the research.
So on the relationship with the British Empire in specific, the debate in India is, of course, in a sense, a reductionist one. It's his mercy petition versus a communist mercy petition versus some other revolutionaries who wrote for pardon. A recent article by a BJP leader releases letters written by Mahatma Gandhi, where he describes himself as faithful, when he's in the early years interacting with leaders of the British Empire. How do you see this? And I know you mentioned somewhere in the book that this is reductionist. Savarkar's sort of legacy cannot be reduced to, whether he wrote that mercy petition or he didn't. But it is a big trope in the current debate around Savarkar. How do you see it? If we look at Rahul Gandhi's recent statement about the whole issue of the valediction of his letters, and I think, this is something, if you look at letter writing in the late 18th century or letter writing in the 19th century, they follow a specific pattern, whether it's George Washington, whether it's Karl Marx in the 19th century, or whether it's Savarkar in the 20th century. The use of the word beg, the use of the phrase obedient servant is part of a normal process of letter writing that we see across, almost a century and a half. So I think this whole issue of Savarkar's use of the word beg, or Gandhi's use of the word beg, with the Hindutva folks will say, look, Gandhi also used that same terminology, or using obedient servant. I think those are, for me, kind of not really interesting and really lead us nowhere, because in a sense, if you look at letter writing, it's kind of part of the process. Now, Savarkar's statements about loyalty to the British in his petitions is something I think that is worth interrogating. But I also like to remind people that immediately after he's released and is under house arrest in Ratnagiri, he's not loyal. I mean, his activities and his writings are simply not loyal in the way that, his critics sort of say. So that's another thing to think about. I also argue that less than a year before he wrote the 1920 petitions, which everyone cites, including Rahul Gandhi, he writes a letter to his brother that he's extremely ill. He's been ill for 2 years. His body weight had decreased to about 95 pounds. He thought he was going to die. And I think it's really important to have that context as well. And I think, but at another level, he's a great admirer of the British Empire. I mean, if you look at his book, Hindu Padpadshahi, on the history of the Marathas, in the conclusion, he says we can't begrudge the British for their world empire, their great empire. And so in a sense, he's a celebrator of empire. It's just the fact that, he wants to understand how the persistence of different Islamic empires, why the British and the Portuguese and the French were able to establish empires in India, and how the Hindu empire can be resurrected, right? This is his key ultimate goal is the revival of the Hindu empire. So the idea of a sort of, a layer of machismo, if you will, being added to the imagined Hindu identity as he saw it, how does that square with, in a way, the other counter trope of Hinduism as not being codified, as not being centered around a single idea, a single book, of being this inclusive, all-accommodating, philosophy, where India's Supreme Court, I think, described it as a way of life rather than a singular sort of truth. And even today in contemporary Indian politics, you will find politicians, including of the right-wing, Hindu right-wing, argue that, look, Hindus are different from Muslims in that there's an essentialism in this argument, in that, we are not militant. So how does this square with Savarkar's postulation of violence and Hindutva?
Yeah. So I guess there are two parts to the question, right? One is in many ways, Savarkar would agree with the first part, that Hindus have a very vast literary tradition, that the Hindu religion that there isn't one book, and he actually argues against the Bhagavad Gita as being the singular book for Hindus. He says that we have a plural tradition of a plural textual tradition, so he wants to celebrate the plural textual tradition. But at the same time, within that plural textual tradition, he's very selective in selecting the Bhagavad Gita or selecting the Ramayana, which he writes mostly about. He writes about the Puranas and other texts as well, but he's interested in the Gita and the Ramayana because he says that they provide us examples of the ways in which gods used violence as part of their being, right? And that the problem within Hindu history for Savarkar is that people like the Buddha or Mahatma Gandhi, when they're advocating nonviolence, he says that they're actually arguing, their arguments are antithetical to being a Hindu, right? So for him, writing these Hindu histories and to search for these Hindu actors in the past who took up violence, who sometimes took up brutal violence, right? He's a big advocate of thinking about sort of cruelty and super savage cruelty, as he says, and inflicting that super savage cruelty, especially on Hindus, right? Who are betraying this martial and violent nature of the Hindu, right? And so for him, the individuals who need to suffer the greatest amount of violence and cruelty are actually those who are advocating nonviolence, right? So this is something that he is for him is quite important.
Yeah, and one of the nuggets in your book, well, at least I didn't know, is that that his book or one of his books is published by the Indian National Army, and you talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about how you stumbled upon that, and you then try and investigate and research that further. And I think it's on 1857, the First War of Independence. Yes.
So, I mean, Savarkar's book, the Indian War of 1857, is an interesting text for many reasons. I mean, there's a kind of its own history is quite interesting because he couldn't find a publisher and tried to get it published in Germany by a press that published Sanskrit books. But what's interesting regarding how the Indian National Army gets it is, my suspicion is that first it's translated in German. So the Nazis, the German Foreign Office in 1940 translates it into German. And because of, in Berlin, the connections between sort of various Indians who were based in Berlin and the connections with Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, that this book ends up being published by the Japanese Ministry of Propaganda in Kuala Lumpur in 1945. And one of the other interesting things about the book is that there are images in the book that are taken and reproduced in Germany as anti-British propaganda, and then they're used by the Japanese and reprinted again in Malaysia at the same time. So there is this kind of global history of this text as well.
Finally, you actually have studied Savarkar as someone who has impacted political thought. So if you were to look at contemporary politics, where most do you see the Savarkar influence?
I would say that, I mean, this is something that I've both thought about and struggled with in the sense, because at one level I argue that the supporters of Hindutva don't read Savarkar, right? Mm-hmm. So how does Savarkar's ideas then get reproduced, right? And I think this was something that Savarkar was very well aware of during his lifetime. So Savarkar's tactic was to deliver as many public speeches as possible. And if you look at the transcripts of the speeches, what you see is that he's reproducing the arguments of essentials of Hindutva over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And I think those arguments are constantly being repeated by the Sangh Parivar in many different levels in many different ways. I think one of the key arguments that persists is this argument that the Hindu has the capacity for violence. I think if we think of any one argument that he has restored is that argument, right? That Hindus are formed in the very act of violence, and that Hindus will be in a permanent war moving into the future. So when I hear various individual politicians or others who say that we are now in a 1,000-year war, in many ways it's evoking Savarkar's that we were in a 1,000-year war in the past. Mm-hmm. And now what Hindu history is going to do is going to allow us the platform to think about the future, right? And so for me, it's no surprise that the supporters of Hindutva target academics, target historians, because Savarkar's definition of Hindutva is a history, which is something very unique. And I think that is what persists, right? That without this Hindu history of violence, Hindutva itself as a concept cannot exist, right? And I think they're aware of that. So the fight is over not only the category of Hindutva, but also this history which celebrates Hindu violence. And that's what Savarkar's legacy in many ways is.
Fascinating. And the one thing, that is clear is that Savarkar is going to be a political backdrop to many of our current conversations, however ill-informed those conversations might be, because the one thing that your book underlines again and again is, hey, at least go and read the guy before you have an opinion on him. Thank you, Vinayak Chaturvedi, Professor Vinayak Chaturvedi. It's been fascinating. The book is fascinating, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.